we're going to take a look at this week's Torah portion, Bo. It's translated as enter. It's taken from Exodus chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 13, verse 16. And we find that if you've read it, you know that it covers the final 3 plagues of the 10. It covers locust, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. But we find that even more so, as it's closing out this chapter of the judgments upon Egypt, it actually also goes in and launches Israel onto their Exodus journey. And how many realize that this was the culmination, this was the pinnacle, this was the whole goal of everything that's taken place from Exodus 1:1 to here was to bring Israel out. This was the purpose. And yet we understand as we look at this that all of these events become a prophetic shadow picture. It's not only detailing what was taking place thousands of years ago in physical Egypt, but it's a shadow picture pointing towards this future coming season of judgment that we've actually entered into. And it once again is going to be a setting free of the house of Israel. Amen? If you're part of the house of Israel, that should be a form of excitement to you, because as we see these things happening, that means I'm about to be set free. I'm about to be restored. Amen? There's a greater exodus in the days that are upon us now. Now, we have to keep in mind as we look at this, how many of you realize that the judgments, as they continue to unfold, it's multi-purpose. And it's very easy, especially if you listen to those that aren't hearing from Yahweh, but they're only looking at what they see with their natural eyes. It's very easy to become fearful, to become agitated, to become someone that, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? What's happening? And yet it's multi-purpose. And for those that are hearing from Yahweh, you know, yes, these things are coming. These things are going to happen, and you're going to have to walk through them. You're not getting a get-out-of-jail-free card. But for those that have ears to hear, we know that there's another dimension to this. Not only is it the judgment upon the world, and we know it starts in his house first, but it's also for the purpose of preparing and transforming Israel into the nation that we were called to be. Amen? In fact, we find that this event, the setting free of Israel, is so significant that Yahweh declares that this month, the month of Aviv, it will be the first month of the year. And when we become so accustomed to the calendar arguments, we completely lose sight of the meaning of his timepiece. And we only argue about who's correct, how do we calculate this, and yet we completely miss what just took place here. Yahweh shifts his clock. He shifts his timepiece right here when Israel is set free and delivered. That begs a closer look. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, it says, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." And so we're going to begin to break this down in the Hebrew language, because everything that's happened, everything that's transpired from the water turning to blood all the way to the death of that firstborn and the cross or the passing over of Israel has been leading them to this moment where Yahweh shifts or changes his clock piece in order to declare what's just taken place. Israel is now free. Let's look at this term beginning. This will be the beginning of months to you. It's Strong's number 7218. It's the Hebrew word rosh. It means head, top, summit, beginning, or the best or choicest. And yet, when you begin to study the root stems in the Hebrew language and its cognates, it's quite interesting, because how many of you realize that within the Hebrew language, there's always a blessed aspect and a cursed aspect? And depending on what side of the coin, so to speak, that you're on will determine whether you're going to receive the blessings or the curses when this word comes forth. We find that one group of words infers to be owned due to poverty or low status, to be in a state of bondage and want, in contrast to a previous state of freedom and plenty. Yet from this same root come terms meaning to take possession, to empower, to become the head, or to become prominent. And so when he makes his declaration regarding his calendar, the calculations of this time clock, not only is it saying there's a shift in how they're going to calculate the calendar of Yahweh, but it's a reflection of what's taking place, I believe, within the nation of Israel as a whole. We find that rosh, this word seems to describe there's a status change that's taking place. It's both of those that are in the pinnacle of power, bringing them down to bondage, and those that have been in bondage and slavery, they're now being made empowered and made the head. And so we see this naturally with the nation of Israel and with Egypt. Egypt, the pinnacle of power, has been brought low and is now in bondage. And Israel, the ones that they have enslaved, there's now been a shift, a change. They're empowered and they're made the head. And it seems as if this is being reflected in the very way that Yahweh is going to calculate his calendar. He changes it to reflect the fact that there's been a change, there's been a shift that's taking place, and now Israel, who was in bondage, is now born again, so to speak. Now we find that this calendar swap that takes place here, coinciding with Israel's deliverance, it transitions what would have previously have been the first month. In the scriptures, it's called Ethanim, and it's become known now as Tishri. The first becomes the seventh. And the seventh, Aviv, becomes the first. But it's quite interesting because when you look at the meaning of that word ethanim in the Hebrew scriptures, its definition is translated as meaning ever flowing. And it deals with water, waters that aren't cut off. Well, we know that euphemistically waters equal seed. So when ethanim, this seventh month, speaks of waters that will not be cut off, it can also be referring to a seed line that can't be eradicated, a seed line that will not be cut off. And yet it also seems to point to, in this transition that's taking place, it's a reminder that there's been a battle that's been going on since creation. It's the battle between the seed lines, the seed of the serpent and the seed of Messiah. And so this transition that's taking place, I believe it's a reminder to Israel, this isn't just about this physical nation, Egypt, that you were in bondage to, but there's something much bigger going on, and we see this reflected in this calendar change. It's about the battle from the very beginning between the two seed lines. And the one that had been brought low and been put into bondage, there's now a transition. They're now once again the head, the Rosh, the beginning, the choice one. But we have to ask, is there further insight into this status change that can be gleaned here? It's quite interesting because ethanim in the Hebrew language, it has a numerical value of 511. Aviv has a value of 15. If you subtract the value of Aviv from ethanim, it equals 496. Well, 496 just so happens to be the value of the Hebrew word malkut, kingdom. But it's also the value of the Hebrew word kelamut, which means shame and disgrace. And it's quite interesting because kelamut, this word for shame and disgrace, it's formed with the exact same letters as the word for kingdom. Remember, there's a blessed aspect and there's a cursed aspect for every Hebrew word. Well, this term kelamut comes from the root word kalam, and it means to be disgraced, to be ashamed, to be humiliated, but also to wound, as in to pierce or prick. In other words, the shame, the disgrace, the humiliation is brought upon by one that has been pierced or pricked. Isn't it interesting that the serpent is still attempting to pierce or prick the kingdom, the Malkut, today in order to gain access, just as he did in the Garden of Eden? Isn't that interesting? Situations change, kingdoms change, faces change, but the game plan is the same. It's the same since the beginning. It seems that Yahweh then changes the whole order of time to draw attention to the fact that the kingdom, the Malkut, that had been shamed, disgraced, and humiliated by the piercing of the serpent, it's no accident that this would have taken place in that first month that has now become the seventh, Ethanim, Adam being created on the first, according to the sages, of Ethanim or Tishri. But now the one that has been shamed, disgraced, and humiliated, we find in this transition, this shift that's taking place, they're restored. There's a status change that's taking place. Israel, the Malkut, now has that shame and disgrace removed, and they're being empowered and made the head once again. Amen? In other words, it's as if Israel now becomes symbolic of the Adam on the earth. And the Adam that previously has allowed himself to be pierced and become an opening for the serpent to come in, now that's all been changed in the midst of this shift, this change, this status that's taking place. And now once again, Adam, Israel is the Malkut, the kingdom. Now remember, this is not only pointing back to what's taking place here in Egypt, in the midst of this transition that's happening, but it becomes a prophetical declaration regarding the Malkut in the end days, who the serpent will once again attempt to pierce or wound. This is what we're seeing right now. Yet we've been given a promise that there is a status change and a shift that's going to take place in these days right now. But it causes us to ask the question, how is this shame and disgrace removed? Because it looks as if Israel's been clothed in this. They've been walking around in this. They've been in bondage for so long. So how is Yahweh now going to remove this shame and disgrace that has become their garments for so long? Well, let's look at the word for months. He says that this will be the head of the year, and this will be the first of the months to you. The word months in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 2320, Kodesh, and it means the new moon or month, but it comes from the root word, Strong's number 2318, Kadash, which means to be new, to renew, to repair. It can also mean to rebuild, to renovate, or to reconstruct, such as the reconstruction or the rebuilding of the altar. And that's quite interesting because we understand, and if you read Shepherd John's book, then you know you're a living, walking altar. That's what you were created to be. Israel is supposed to be functioning as a living, walking altar, literally a doorway or access point through which Yahweh's presence is made manifest and a point of contact. You're the connection between the spiritual and the physical. This is how we function as the Malkut or as the kingdom. And yet we find if we go all the way back, that altar has been pierced. It's been wounded. And with it came shame, disgrace, humiliation. And yet now he's made a promise to Israel all the way at the end of the judgments upon Egypt. The stones have been repaired. The stones had to be repaired. They had to be rebuilt. And so we find that as he's judging and tearing down the altars of Egypt, he's simultaneously building back and repairing his people. And so now when we look at these coming events and what's happening right now in the midst of us, we can be focused on the fact, oh my goodness, look what's happening in the world. And we can be fearful and we can be concerned. How are we going to live? How are we going to survive? And yet for those that have ears to hear with, you're reminded that as he's tearing this down, his people are being built back. Amen? They're being repaired. The shame and disgrace is being removed, and now they're becoming that living altar that they were created to be. Amen? So it seems that this statement, when he talks about this shift, this change in the calendar, there's a lot more that he's revealing to Israel for them to understand, because if they miss this, if they don't understand it, then everything that he's done to bring them out, what was the purpose? In fact, we see this. That generation, they miss this, and it takes the following generation raised up in the wilderness to actually become these living, walking altars. And so it seems that this statement is not only describing a calendar change taking place, but it reveals the very purpose of everything Israel has went through leading up to this moment. The one who was in bondage, poverty, with low status, has now undergone a transition to become one who is empowered and able to take possession of a promised inheritance. Yet this change of status is made possible by the renewal, the repairing, and the rebuilding of the altar stones that are Israel. And we find that while all the focus has seemingly been on the destruction of Egypt's status changed from one that was in power to now one that's been brought low and is in bondage. And we see that Egypt literally comes into bondage to the very fallen ones that they had worshipped and revered. These were the gods they worshipped. These are the ones that they were an altar to. And when they show up, they find out they weren't as benign or nice as they thought. And while the focus seems to be, even in the scriptures, the focus is on what's happening in Egypt, there's an underlying story that's taking place. We find that at the exact same time, Yahweh's orchestrating these same events and season to be a time of restoring and repairing his altar stones, his Eben. And isn't it interesting that the word Eben is the same root in Hebrew that gives us the word for sons? Amen? He's restoring his sons in the midst of destroying and bringing down Egypt and the powers that be that Egypt worships and represents. Amen? He then goes on to name this season or this month, and it's quite interesting because not all of the months are actually named in the scriptures. I think it's just about 4 of them that you will actually find a name listed in the scriptures and not just in the rabbinical writings. Aviv is one of them, and Ethanim, the 7th month, is the other. Let's look at the word Aviv. It's Strong's number 24, Aviv, and it's translated as meaning fresh, young barley ears, the month of greening, the month the ears were developed. And when I saw that, of course, it's talking about barley. We understand corn and barley, these are types of grains, and it talks about they grow in the form of ears. The barley ears were developed. But isn't it quite interesting because it seems as if there's a little bit of a word play that takes place here. Do you think that maybe our season of deliverance as well will be based upon when our ears are developed? When your sense of hearing is developed, this is now the season that you come out. In other words, it seems as if, and in fact, we're going to look at this. The Egyptians make the statement, Egypt is destroyed. That's after the 7th one. They didn't even need the last 3. They already acknowledged, we're destroyed. There's nothing left. We've been cut off. We've been destroyed. And yet it still takes a little bit longer. Why? Because the hearing of Israel still had to come and be developed fully before they could be delivered. Amen? In fact, in rabbinical writings, the yoke of the kingdom of man is contrasted to that of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Remember, this is about the Malkut coming forth, about the Malkut being restored. And the yoke of the kingdom of heaven is likened unto the yoke of the Torah. In other words, being obedient and keeping the Torah, which is where Israel is headed when they leave to come and accept this yoke, to hear the words of the Torah. And it is said that when the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, the yoke of Torah is accepted, is when we proclaim the Shema. When we proclaim, hear, O Israel. When we hear, understand, and are obedient to that word, we declare this. It's literally an oath of our loyalty to the kingdom of heaven. Amen? And so we find that when Israel hears, they literally take on the yoke of being the kingdom. They have now become the Malkut. The kingdom is among you. Now, I want you to notice as well, we've already kind of hinted at this, how long it takes for Israel to hear. When Moshe first shows up, he arrives with the message that the deliverer is here. It's time to go. He says the key phrase that Joseph told them to listen for. And yet it takes 10 judgments, 10 plagues later before the hearing of Israel is fully developed. Because they come out in the month when the ears were developed, when the ability to hear is finally there. And it seems to indicate that true hearing, to Shema, to hear, to understand, and to be obedient, it's a season. It takes time to truly hear. Hence why faith comes by hearing, and hearing the word. Why? True hearing is a process. It's quite interesting because we find that many individuals will tell you, I heard a word. The very next week, they are doing the opposite of the very word they said they heard. And so we have to ask ourselves, there's only 2 possible scenarios. Either they lied, they didn't hear, because it can't be Yahweh. Yahweh doesn't change. If he sent his word, it will accomplish what he sent it to do. So either they did not hear, and they're a liar. The second option is they heard. Yahweh gave them a word, a truthful word, yet they did not allow that hearing to fully mature. They heard it, but before it was allowed to come all the way to fruition, they leave. They don't gain an understanding, and therefore they're not obedient. That's the only 2 options. Be careful what you hear. When you look at this term Aviv a little bit further, it's interesting that breaking it apart, it forms the word Avi. It's spelled Aleph, Beit, Yod, Beit. So the root is Avi, my father. And then attached to this is the letter Beit, which represents the house. In other words, Israel is ready to come out of Egypt when they have become my father's house. When they have become the Malkut, the kingdom, when they are ready to be my Father's house, you will leave your place of bondage. Amen? And so it seems to indicate that also for you and I, whatever you may be going through, sometimes we are in our own personal seasons of being in that place of bondage, of being in this season where it seems as if you've been confined and restricted, and yet it's a reminder that this is a season where he's repairing, rebuilding, and causing this altar to be restored. And when this altar is ready to become my Father's house, when you fully matured, understood the word, been walking in obedience, now is your season to come out of that. Amen? And how many of you realize what will look like at the time as if it was meant for evil, Yahweh will turn it around for your good, because to come out in an immature state will cause you to be cut off and miss the promises that he was attempting to prepare you for and restore you to. Amen? Now let's look at Exodus chapter 13, verse 4. As he continues this line of thought, it says, "This day came you out in the month of Aviv." In Hebrew, it says, "Hayom atim yotzim bechodesh ha'aviv." I want to look at the term "came out." This day you came out. It's Strong's number 3318, Yetzah, and it means to go out, come out, exit, or go forth, but it specifically means to go forth with a purpose or for a result. It has the sense of direction, to be headed towards something. But it's interesting because it can also mean to germinate, to cause a seed to begin to grow and put off shoots after a period of dormancy, or to expand as a plant. In other words, when he makes this statement, "On this day you came out," it's indicating finally on this day something has germinated. Something has begun to grow within Israel. The seed of the word that was planted by Joseph, I believe, upon his instructing of the children of Israel before he passes, and then it's reaffirmed when Moshe shows up. That seed of that word that was planted, it now has finally, after this period of dormancy where it seems as if it's been cut off, it's finally begun to put forth new growth and shoots forth. In other words, it's that gestational cycle in order for them to properly hear. They hear this word at the very beginning. Moshe comes to them and tells them that the deliverer has arrived, and yet that word has to be planted, and it has to go through that natural cycle until finally it begins to burst forth and grow. And now, when that word is beginning to produce and bring forth fruit, on this day you come out. Amen? It's quite interesting because here the term yetzah, it's conjugated in this Hebrew phrase as yotzim. And yotzim, this phrase has a value of 151. It's the same value as the phrase Amiel, which means Elohim's people, as well as Lo Ami, not my people. And so we find that on this day, as Israel's coming out, I believe there's multiple fold things taking place here. Not only is it identifying this is Elohim's people, but these are Lo Ami. These are not my people. And so we find, so this is the purpose of the entire journey, and these Exodus plagues that are falling, it's separating the people. It's separating the flocks. How many realize Jacob does the same thing in Laban's house? He separates his flocks before he's ready to go. Then when he leaves, he takes Amiel. He takes Elohim's people. And he leaves Lo Ami, not my people. Now, it's a foreshadowed fulfillment, this statement, as well, I believe, of Hosea chapter 2, verse 23, that says, "And I will sow her unto me in the earth, and I will have mercy upon her that had not obtained mercy, and I will say to them which were not my people, Lo Ami, thou art my people. And they shall say, thou art my Elohim." Amen? We find that on this day, the day that Israel comes out, they are now identified, you are my people. It seems to infer that previous to this, they were in the same category as the Egyptians and everyone else. They were not my people. But it took this season of restoring, rebuilding, and repairing those altar stones. And at the very end of this cycle of restoration, now Israel is identified. Finally, you are my people. Isn't it interesting that the entire time Moshe declares, let my people go? But how many times, how often do you realize that if Yahweh speaks for something, it's usually an immediate? He says it and it's done. Moshe says this 10 times, if not more. Sometimes he repeats himself, let my people go, and yet there's no people going all the way until the last time he says it, let my people go. Why? Because it's not until the end. Now, finally, Israel fits the description, and the command is fulfilled. Let my people go. Where are they? They're not there yet. Let my people go. They're still not identified as that. All the way at the end, let my people go. Israel finally looks and can fit the description. This is my people. And now my people go. Amen? Now, looking at this statement in the fullness found within the language, we find that on this day, the word of Yahweh has germinated within Israel. It's put forth new growth, causing those who had been called not his people to now be identified as his sons and daughters because of the seed or word within them. It indicates, I believe, it's a DNA match. You can identify where you came from, who your parents are, whose house you belong to. And it seems as if he's been planting the seed or the word within Israel, and they've had to learn to hear that word so it can produce within them. So now when it comes time to check and do that DNA match, who belongs to my house, they now look like my house. They now are my people. Perhaps now you can realize why the enemy is attempting to pierce your DNA all the way today in the natural as well as the spiritual. Why? Because if he can affect the literal physical DNA of man, it's an indicator then that your hearing or your spiritual DNA has also been compromised. And if you don't have the right DNA, in other words, you don't look like my people, you don't fit into this category, you've been compromised. This is why I believe the ability for Israel to properly hear and receive the word or the seed becomes paramount. They have to learn to hear. Why? Because their ability to hear, once that word goes in, that word, that seed that gets planted, it begins to grow out and affect their entire being. It repairs and restores their very DNA so they can be identified as my people, a restored, rebuilt altar for Yahweh. Amen? In the month of Aviv, you go out. In the season when they repaired and rebuilt the Father's house, the living stones of his altar. Now, we've already made the statement that from the Egyptians' own perspective, they're destroyed before the 10th plague ever came. But the house, Israel, wasn't finished being built just yet. And since this is about Israel being restored, Egypt, you're just going to have to hold on a little longer and take a little bit more of the judgments and the plagues because I'm waiting on my people to hear. Amen?